Hello and welcome to the Good Dirt Podcast. We're so glad you're here. I'm Mary.
And I'm Emma, and together we are the mother-daughter duo behind Lady Farmer, where we're all about cultivating a lifestyle that's simple, intentional, and connected to the rhythms of nature.
As we take a winter pause until spring, we're excited to share some of our favorite moments from the podcast with you. Think of it as a time to listen, reflect, and reconnect, like cozying up with an old friend.
Each week during this break, we'll be revisiting conversations that explore themes close to our hearts, like sustainable living, regenerative agriculture, and anything embracing slow living.
We also want to let you know about our Substack. If you're not already subscribed, it's a great way to stay in touch. You'll find thoughtful reflections, resources, and updates on what we're up to. You'll see it all there, but we'll be pausing paid subscriptions while we're on break.
Just a quick note, some details, especially in the introductions of these older episodes, might feel a little dated or like they're from a different season than the one that you're hearing them in. And if you hear references to retreats, our online community, the store, or sponsorships, or any other time-sensitive offerings, keep in mind that they may not still apply. To stay up to date on everything, like we said, be sure to follow us on Instagram at We Are Lady Farmer and definitely subscribe to our Substack.
We hope these encore episodes spark inspiration for your journey toward a life that's more aligned with the earth and yourself. It's such a joy to share this space with you.
Thank you for being a part of this community. It's your presence and passion that keeps us grounded and growing. Now, let's get into it.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Emma and Mary Kingsley, the mother-daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now. The farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this last day of January in the new year and this bonus episode of the Good Dirt Podcast on the eve of the Festival of Imbolc, which is an ancient Celtic tradition celebrating the beginning of spring. Now, it still might feel like spring is a long way off, but it's true that we've reached the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So, believe it or not, spring is now officially on its way. In the Christian church, February 1st is also the feast day of Saint Brigid, a figure of ancient Celtic folklore, as well as a recognized historical figure in the Christian church. If you aren't familiar with Brigid and all the wonderful stories and legends surrounding her, you're in for a real treat because today we're bringing back a special episode from 2 years ago, during which we learned all about her in our conversation with Kathy Spaar, who you will hear introduced. And I won't say too much about it right now because it's all to come. But I will say, when you listen through, hopefully, you'll come to more of an understanding of why we feel so connected to the spirit of Brigid here at Lady Farmer, and to learn about how you can incorporate the blessing of Brigid into your life as we move towards spring. But before we get started, I want to share with you a story. You will hear in this discussion that one of the many aspects of Brigid is that she is the patron saint of midwives. Well, one of our listeners, whose name is Kesslyn, shared something very special on Instagram about hearing this very episode. And I'd like to read an excerpt of what she said. So, these are Kesslyn's words. Today marks 1 year of my midwifery journey. On August 14th, 2021, I attended my first birth, where I held the intention of training to become a midwife. I left that birth overwhelmed with a sense of purpose and direction. I could see this golden thread that weaved through so much of my childhood, my passions, and my dreams that led me to that night. It was a feeling of confirmation unlike any other I've ever felt. I realized something this week as I attended my 47th birth as an apprentice midwife, sending me back to March of 2021. I had been praying for the Lord's direction in my education and career, and I was listening to a podcast episode from We Are Lady Farmer. The episode was on the history and folklore of Brigid. I was so intrigued by this woman, a midwife. I had only heard of midwives in a past tense, but was encouraged to research modern midwifery. So began my journey of personal and professional growth, one that has stretched me and shaped me and that continues to better me as a woman of this earth and a child of God. Oh, what a year it has been. I've spent my morning reminiscing on the past year and listening and reading about Brigid of Ireland. Thank you so much, Kesslyn, for sharing that story. We feel so honored that you found such inspiration from the Good Dirt podcast. That is truly a gift to us as well. And you, our listeners, can follow Kesslyn on Instagram at Gem Wellness Official. That's GEM Wellness Official. And we'll tag this below as well. You can hear more of her story and more about Brigid and her stories and highlights and her ongoing connection to Brigid as a guide and an inspiration. So with that, we'll head on into a reprise of our episode from 2 years ago, including the original intro that Emma and I recorded and which gave me a good laugh when I heard it again. So here we are with Kathy Spaar on the history and folklore of Brigid. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Emma. Can you believe we are at the end of January?
No, I can't. It's been a really crazy month. So I'm ready to move on.
Yeah. If you're like me, you're ready for a little change of pace. And I actually really love this particular moment in the year because it is kind of a change of pace when we're just barely beginning to think about spring as something that's out there kind of making its way to us. There's plenty of winter to go, but we're thinking more about it.
And it's almost the feast day of St. Brigid.
Yes, beloved Brigid, who is the focus of today's episode.
With our special guest, Kathy Spaar.
Who is actually my first cousin.
Which makes her my second cousin, I think.
Or something like that. But anyway, you call her your Aunt Kathy. But she is indeed part of the Lady Farmer family and someone who's taught us so much on our own spiritual journey.
Yeah, so Aunt Kathy is a spiritual director who has spent many years traveling and exploring a path that's taken her many directions. And she introduced us to the knowledge and wisdom of Brigid many years ago. I was just a little kid.
Yeah, when we were still living in Georgia in the 90s, I remember I traveled up here to Washington, D.C. to attend a weekend retreat celebrating St. Brigid that Kathy was leading. It was held at the Washington National Cathedral, and what a beautiful transformational weekend that was. I'll never forget it. There was a full moon, and we gathered in the cold outside on the cathedral close one night as part of the celebration. And it's just so vivid in my mind to this very day. It was really magical. Do you have any memories of Brigid as a child or what you knew about her or learned about her?
Yeah, I was really fascinated with her. I guess it might have been sometime around that time when you took that trip because I decided to do a report on her in 3rd grade. I don't remember what the assignment was, but I felt like one of those trifold presentation boards about St. Brigid.
Don't remember that. Tell me more about it. Maybe I'll remember.
I don't remember much either. I do remember that the board was a little sparse. Like there wasn't like a whole lot to like really say because it's a lot of like legend. But I did cover it in green felt, you know, because Ireland and whatnot. And I engineered a special speaker system with my headphones from my Walkman. Like I cut holes in the cardboard and like poked them through and I played Enya on my Walkman. So when you were walking past my board, you had a little soundtrack.
That's really awesome. I wish I could say I remembered that.
Oh, and it's remember it was one song on repeat. I just remembered that. And so my poor teacher. Yeah, it was one song on. It was like the Celt. Did any have a song like Celtic something or the Celts or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Celts.
The Celts. It's that song on repeat.
I think it works okay with that song.
Yeah.
I think that was probably a really great touch. You think it was one of those reports that everybody thought the parent did?
I don't think so, actually. Anyways.
Well, I think the fact that I have zero memory of it suggests that I had nothing to do with it.
It's true.
Back to Brigid. I think what I appreciate most deeply about Brigid is how she elevates the sacred in the ordinary, the very simple tasks of being human, giving birth, growing food, preparing food, tending to the earth, making a home, caring for children and animals and the sick and the needy, and even weaving cloth, weaving words into poetry. And she was even like a blacksmith. She made metalcraft and fermenting. What a lady farmer. She's actually the very spirit of a slow living.
Sounds like a badass.
I think she's pretty badass.
So we like to claim her as the patron saint of Lady Farmer, officially, unofficially, whatever you would like. If you're just now becoming acquainted with Brigid, or even if you already know her, we hope you've enjoyed this episode full of stories of Brigid. Just sit back and relax and listen to Aunt Kathy tell us these wonderful stories of this legendary figure.
And you will be forever blessed for welcoming Brigid into your day. So enjoy.
Yeah, and if you want a little extra special effects, if you have another device, you can also play, or if you're Walkman, you can play Enya the Celts in the background while you listen to this. It'll be a good effect. I don't think we can do that for copyright purposes, but we would if we could. Anyways, enjoy.
I am a spiritual director, an environmental education teacher. Recently, I've been working with Monticello here in Charlottesville, where I live, and working also with a number of other organizations, including Coming to the Table, which is a national organization dedicated to overcoming racial injustice. As far as Brigid's been in my life for a long time, I guess the first time I really heard about Brigid was when I went to Ireland and Scotland. I'd been interested in Celtic history and spirituality for a long time, but I was really interested more in the pre-Christian part, all the standing stones. And I heard a little bit about goddesses, the ancient Celtic goddesses, but it really wasn't until I went on a spiritual pilgrimage to Scotland and Ireland that suddenly Brigid became really dominant. And so I made a special trip to Kildare, which is the site of her original abbey and church. There's a cathedral there, and her old fire temple is still there. And this was in the early 1990s. And I actually happened to meet one of the Brigiding sisters. There's an order of St. Brigid that's been reformed after it had fallen away for several centuries. And they came back to Kildare and established a place. They started in a small house and they relit Brigid's fire, Brigid's temple flame. And they have renewed the celebration of Brigid's life and her feast on February 1st, which we'll talk about. So I was really inspired by what I learned there. And I've come back. I've brought other women back to Kildare on pilgrimage. And we've watched that center grow. And that's very exciting. I can go into more of that later. But that's sort of the general thread of how I came to know Brigid.
You taught me about Brigid. I first learned about her from you, and you were doing workshops and gatherings around Brigid, from the late 90s.
That was after the first trip, after I'd met Sister Rita Minahan and some of the other sisters. and came back just full of stories and wanting to do something. Brigid's the goddess of poetry. She's the goddess of the land and also a saint. She's an abbess, and she has her own abbey, her own monastery, a double monastery of men and women. So there was just a lot of really interesting things to put together. So I intersected with our friend Betty, who had just come back from a writing retreat in Whidbey Island. I don't know, we had just been so inspired by those two experiences that we decided to put it together. And so those are those weekends around Brigid's feast day, where we celebrated with poetry and silence, with lots of food and feasting, light and dark, song and dance. And it was so much fun. We've done it over and over again.
Tell us more about that specific day and where it falls on the liturgical calendar, how it ties into its pre-Christian and Christian counterpart and the seasonal shift and everything there.
First of all, to explain how Brigid is both a goddess and a saint. So the origins of Brigid are really wrapped in history, but she's held an important place in the Celtic lands forever. And it's a real challenge to separate the goddess Brigid from the Saint Brigid because they're so tightly interwoven. But Brigid sort of entered written history in 7th AD, I think, when a Celtic monk wrote about her life. Most of it, of course, is legend and folklore. But we learned that the Saint Brigid had a very strong faith. She was known for her healing powers, her skill with animals, as well as her hospitality and generosity, particularly her generosity to the poor. But if we look back further in time, we find that before Christianity, there was a devotion to both male and female deities. But Brigid was one of the main female goddesses of the Celtic world. And there she had some other traits. As I mentioned earlier, she was associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft, that is, crafting out of metal. She was also associated with fire and fertility. And then slowly, as Christianity took root in the British Isles and in Ireland, the power of these deities began to fade, but there were certain beliefs and practices that were assimilated into the Christian tradition because I think they were so important, they just couldn't die. And so Brigid was one of those crossover saints. So she was too embedded in the landscape to eliminate. So they made her a saint. And so she's associated with sacred wells and fire and celebration. And that gets to the point of the Celtic calendar. The Celtic calendar is designed around the equinoxes and the solstices. And between each equinox and solstice, there's what they call a cross-quarter day. And there's a major Gaelic festival on all of those cross-quarter days. And the first one is Imbolc, or St. Brigid's feast day, which is February 1st. Then comes Beltane, that's May 1st. Then Lugnaza, I think I'm pronouncing that right, August the 1st. And then Samhain, November 1st. So she starts the year. She is the goddess of new life and new beginnings. So her feast day falls on February 1st.
There are many tales and legends of Brigid as both goddess and saint, from pre-Christian to Christian times. What are some of your favorite stories about her?
Well, one of the favorite stories is about Brigid's birth. She was born on the threshold of a druid's house. And the way the story goes, her mother, Brukasa, was a Christian slave, and her father was a pagan chieftain. The chieftain sold Brukasa to a druid when she was pregnant with Brigid. And Brukasa's jobs in the new house was to take care of the sheep and the cows. So her duties were to rise early in the morning, go down and feed the animals, milk the cows. So on February 1st, which is the cross-quarter day in the Celtic calendar, she awoke, and as she was stepping across the threshold to go to the barn, she stopped, and lo and behold, Brigid was born right there on the threshold. The maid servants came to help take the baby to bathe her in the milk, which was sitting beside her. She'd put the pail down to have Brigid. And then she swaddled her in a woolen cloak and went to finish her chores. So during that time, while she was away, the neighbors happened to be looking out, and they suddenly saw a flame coming out of the Druid's house. And so they ran to put the fire out. But when they arrived, there was no fire. Instead of a fire, there was a very bright halo of light around Brigid's head. And all of the neighbors there, all of the people who heard the story, knew that this was a very special young girl. This was a sign that she was a girl full of grace with the Holy Spirit and very special abilities. So that is the Christian tale, but it connects back to more ancient understandings of Brigid among the Celts. They saw Brigid as a goddess, as the divine feminine energy that served as a vessel or container for the fire that resides in each of us. So that's a particular gift of Brigid. She's a guardian at the threshold of a new morning, of a new season, of new life. And so she becomes a guide at the threshold between the old season and the new, and between the visible and invisible worlds. So St. Brigid's Day is the Christian name for Imbolc. We can imagine how the Celts of ancient times would be waiting for the spring to come. After a long, dark winter, the rivers and streams might begin to thaw, might be waiting for the cows and the ewes to begin birthing the calves and the lambs. I know in Scotland, Brigid was considered an old woman who would become the new maiden of the spring. Brigid, the goddess of fertility and new life. There's a wonderful poem, which I'd like to share. She opens it with this invocation, which I think gives you an idea of just how important this season was. February, month of St. Fried. Earth has long lain white, rigid, locked into lifelessness. Ice on river, no lively running. Ice on field, no soft furrow. Ice on bare, no boon for beasts. Ice on hill, no high pasture. Ice on heart, no hope leaping. We call her now to walk on the riverbank. Brigid of Ireland, Fried of Wales, the saint, the golden one who breaks the ice. Dipping first one hand, then two hands, freeing the river to flow into time of seed, time of ripening, time of harvest. We greet her now, as for so many centuries, Winter Star people greeted her, from her churches and her wells, from the cold seacoast and the doorstep of hill farms, with the immemorial cry, Fried is come, Fried is welcome.
I love the winter images and all of that.
It's really amazing how she is this goddess woman saint that really transcends, like, she's cross-cultural and she has different names, but it's one person, right?
One energy.
It's one archetype or one aspect of the divine feminine, truly. As you travel through all the different Celtic lands, you hear about Brigid in different ways. There are lots of healing wells that are named after Brigid because she is the goddess of healing, or was considered the goddess of healing, and then becomes the saint of healing. She's embedded in the landscape, in the wells, often many times in the hills. And she is the woman of the land, which is another story to tell you if you'd like to hear it.
Yes.
So in the earlier story, as you know, she grew up in the house of a Druid. And the Druid, with everyone else, recognized the special gifts that Brigid had, the special blessing from God. Eventually, as Brigid grew older, he freed her, and he gave her the gift of a cloak as part of a blessing and a recognition of her special favor with God. And Brigid used this cloak to claim title to the land that would be the place where she would build her monastery and her church. So the story goes that she approached one of the wealthy men of the area and asked him to give her some land for her abbey and for her church. And of course, the man was not about to do that, but jokingly he said, well, I tell you what, I will give you as much land as your cloak will cover if you put it on the ground. She smiled and she said, certainly. Lovely cloak on the ground, and she begins to pray. She prays hard, and suddenly a miracle happens. The cloak begins to grow in all directions, and it grows and it grows, and the rich man begins to become very concerned and upset because it's going for miles in every direction. Suddenly it stops. Brigid stopped praying. She stands up and smiles. And that is how she was able to acquire the land that was to become known far and wide as a place of sanctuary and hospitality to everyone, especially the poor.
As you've been telling us, Brigid is so connected with the landscape and the culture of those Celtic places. And she's associated with so many aspects of an earth-centered life. So can you speak about her and how she represents the essence of the lady farmer? We consider her the quintessential lady farmer. And the idea of slow living through the seasons, sustainability, her connection to the land, cycles of the seasons, plants, animals, birth, food, all these things that are associated with her as an energy of blessing and abundance.
Well, I think Brigid is a perfect companion woman for a lady farmer. She was known as a companion woman and a guide of the land. We see in those stories and descriptions of Brigid that she embodies the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And I mentioned she's associated with the sacred wells and with, of course, breaking up the ice in the early spring. She's associated with fire of the spirit, the fire of poetry, the fire of smithcraft, crafting all of the metalwork and also the weapons, as well as the tools, the farm tools. She's associated with the land, as we've said. She took care of all sorts of animals, growing things. Of course, the monastery was self-sustaining. It grew its food and it had its animals and chickens and all sorts of things. And she was known for taking care and healing animals, as well as all the people who came to be with her. And certainly that idea of community and sharing with everyone, having room for everyone at the table. So I don't know if there's some other elements that you have sort of thought of, Brigid, some other examples and some of the stories that you know or have heard me mention here that you think fits in very well with lady farmers' missions.
Yeah, well, as she represents the gift of fire and flame, she was a goddess of cooking, wasn't she? And hearth, the symbol of the hearth as a place where you create your sustenance and possibly the healing crafts as well. And also, wasn't she the goddess of weaving, as in weaving of cloth and words?
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that she was the goddess of poetry.
Mm-hmm. And weaving across the words. And of course, I must tell you at some point, the weaving of crosses, because that was another thing. Brigid's cross is woven with rushes or with straw. So that is very much a part of her symbol, is weaving. And, as you were saying, the idea of tending the land, tending your garden is also, there's this other part of tending your inner self, tending your spirit and your soul. So there's an inner and an outer part to the sustainability, this inner and outer life that I think that Lady Farmer is trying to promote.
And wasn't she a midwife, or she was an attendant to midwives? Or
she was a midwife. And of course, there's the famous story of being the midwife to Mary, that wonderful cloak that the Druid gave her. It was a blue cloak. And she wore it, of course, as she was tending the sheep in the barn. So she would take them down and close up the barn at night and feed them. And every night it was her custom to kneel down and pray for the safekeeping of the animals. And as she was praying, she suddenly began to feel herself lifted up out of the barn. And she saw that there were these angels that were carrying her through the air. And in fright, she closed her eyes and began to pray again, of course. And when she opened her eyes again, she was in a barn, but not the one she had left. She was in another barn far away, but there were animals there, as well as a young woman laying on the straw. And she saw that the young woman was giving birth. And of course, Brigid, Mary of the Gales, was in attendance. She knew how to help deliver babies. So she was there to help Mary deliver the baby, wrap it in swaddling clothes, and placed it in the manger. So Mary was very grateful for her help and blessed her. And the angels lifted her up back to the barn where she had been praying. When she went back into the house, one of the women said to her, "Look at your cloak." And then she looked down and she saw that her cloak was spangled with all sorts of bright stars that covered the blue cloak.
Oh, that's lovely. So Mary of the Gales is Brigid, that was the midwife in this legend.
Called midwife to Mary, a midwife to Jesus. So that's when you often hear Mary of the Gales. Again, it's the Christian effort to connect Brigid, the saint and the goddess, with the Christian story. And it's a beautiful story. And there's a wonderful children's story about Brigid going to be the midwife to Mary on Christmas Eve.
And it was very important to the Celts that were Christianized over the centuries, that there was this connection with their beloved Brigid. And so she was brought forward from the pre-Christian folklore into the Christian context of the church and the Bible stories. And so that's how they kind of integrated it culturally.
Right. That's how they moved her from just being the aspects of an old goddess and integrated her into the Christian story. So she really became an important saint. She's one of the three saints of Ireland. There's Patrick, and there's Brigid, and there's Columba. That's the Holy Trinity. And it's very rare to see a woman elevated to that level of sainthood. In fact, there is a story, I guess, when the bishop comes to make a nun, blessing her. When he blessed her, it turns out that he gave her the blessing of a bishop as opposed to an abbess or whatever level she was being elevated to. Many people insist that she was a bishop of the church, and she's often shown in icons with her bishop hat.
Oh, wow. Do they think that was like accidentally on purpose, or what's the story?
I'd say it was accidentally on purpose. I mean, God had a higher purpose. And Brigid has always been a little bit of a little twist in the ribs of the patriarchal church, which I think the Brigid sisters are very interested in pointing out.
Yes. On one hand, she's like the ultimate woman's goddess. But she also has this influence over like the institution of the church, and she's an abbess, she's a leader, she's got all these kind of wonderful blend of masculine and feminine characteristics.
Yes. And she can be an abbess, and she can also milk the cows.
What do you think Brigid represents for us right now in the midst of all the chaos that we're experiencing?
I think there are so many aspects of Brigid we can draw on right now. I agree with you. I think we're in a period of great change and challenge. The Brigidine sisters recognize this role and Brigid's legacy. And so they actually, in their ministry, if you go to their website, they're calling forth new energy to reclaim the role of the feminine, to help shape a new paradigm, as they say, where there's room for everyone. So I think that's really a much needed type of energy for the change that we're hoping will come.
So tell us more about Brigid as the healer, since we're so needing healing right now. And so we're calling on Brigid for that energy. Tell us about that.
Well, the story that I love the best is one about inner healing, really, as well as physical healing. There's a famous story about Brigid being called to the side of a dying chieftain who was a pagan. She was trusted by both the Christians and the pagans as a healer. She arrived at his bedside and discovered that the chieftain was very ill, and she didn't quite know what to do except to pray. He was very, very ill and probably on his way to dying. So she sat quietly with him and began to pray. And as she did, she would pick up rushes that were strewn on the floor and begin to weave them into a cross. And the chieftain asked about the significance of what she was doing. What was she making, and what was the cross about? And she told him the story of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. And in telling the story, the chieftain became so moved that he was instantly converted to the faith. Instantly, a peace came over him, and he died without pain or struggle. So Brigid, in this case, did not heal him of his disease, but she healed his spirit so it could be at peace. And this story is said to be the origin of the Brigid crosses, which are woven for St. Brigid's feast. After they're completed, they're hung over the threshold, over the door of the house, and it's said to bring protection and blessing for the next year. And the next year at Imbolc, or Brigid's feast day on February 1st, the old cross is taken down, it's burned in the hearth, and the new one is placed over the threshold. So again, we have the image of Brigid at the threshold, providing protection and blessings for each of the houses that celebrate Brigid's feast.
Ah, and what are some other traditions for the Feast of St. Bridget? I know one about a cloth.
Yeah, there's a wonderful one. So the feast always began the night before. So January 31st, there were a number of things that happened. Many people would take a cloth, lay it outside overnight for Brigid to bless. The dew that would come down during the night would be blessed by Brigid. And so that this would be a cloth usually used for healing of some sort. Many young women, and usually unmarried women, would process through the town and the village with candles. And they would come to each house and people would give them food and there would be blessings and so forth. Let's see, there's some other ones. Sometimes there would be a procession that would have a doll made out of the straw that they would call a bride. And they would often carry her along in their procession and they would sing a hymn to Brigid. And many of the girls would wear the white. Their hair would come down, and that would be a symbol of purity and youth. The songs and the procession and putting out the cloth all began that night. And usually people would come in and they would have a meal and celebrate, burn the old cross and weave the new, and really welcome in the new day and the new season.
What do you think is the most important thing you've learned from her?
The Celtic path that I've been walking for so long has helped me to see the presence of the sacred and the reality of everyday life, like we've talked about. And Brigid has been an important part of that scene for me. And through her, I think I have learned the importance of empowering women to have agency and autonomy, and the importance of building community that nurtures growth and offers healing and hospitality for all.
So Kathy, tell us, how do you think Brigid is related to the good dirt?
Well, as we know from her stories, she was a woman deeply connected to the land, not just the dirt, but also the water, the wells, the animals, the plants, and so forth. But I think if you take that metaphorically, the good dirt, she was really a vessel, or, as I said earlier, a guardian of allowing things to grow. She nurtured people's souls as well as their bodies and as well as their minds. And she did that in various ways, through healing, through feeding and making sure everyone had enough to eat, to be welcoming to them, as well as tending to their souls. And so I think she, in that way, is a woman who can really be ever present in whatever aspect. And she brings that sacred into the everyday life, which I call the good dirt, or can make the dirt good.
That's wonderful. What else would you like to tell us about Brigid? Any more stories? I know you have another poem to read.
I think we could end on a sort of a lighter note. One of the things that she was known for as being the patron saint of beer. She oversaw, of course, the harvesting of the grain, and then, of course, of making the beer itself, and then enjoying it. So we can leave with the idea of Brigid as a party girl, a hostess who liked to throw a good party and have a good time. And so this is reflected in one of the prayers in her honor, which is called the Lake of Ale. And I'd like to read this particular version of it. There are many different versions. This is Brigid talking and giving this prayer. I'd like to give a lake of ale to God. I'd love the heavenly host to be tippling there for all eternity. I'd love the men of heaven to live with me, to dance and sing. If they wanted, I'd put at their disposal vats of suffering. White cups of love I'd give them, with a heart and a half. Sweet pitchers of mercy I'd offer to every man. I'd make heaven a cheerful spot, because happy heart is true. I'd make the men contented for their own sake. I'd like Jesus to be there too. I'd like the people of heaven to gather from all the parishes around. I'd give a special welcome to the women, the three Marys of great renown. I'd sit with the men, the women of God, there by the lake of beer. We'd be drinking good health forever, and every drop would be a prayer.
Now, how can people get in touch with you or follow you in your work or find out more about Brigid or anything you have to leave our audience with in terms of more information?
Well, you can always go online and find a lot of things about Brigid. Some of it is pretty far-fetched, but I would really invite everyone to visit the website of the Brigid Sisters, the ones I mentioned, who are in Kildare, who've established a center for Brigid studies. They offer events. They offer special festivals. In fact, they will be celebrating Imbolc or St. Brigid's Day for a whole week. This year, I guess it'll be virtually. The name of their center is called Solus Brigid. So they're using the Gaelic, and I believe it would be translated into the Flame of Brigid or the Son of Brigid or something. www.solus, S-O-L-A-S, Bride, B-H-R-I-D-E, .ie, which is Ireland.
Great. And we will put that in the show notes. Any books or anything to recommend we can put in the show notes?
Oh my goodness. Well, if you wanted to, the poem I read, Ruth Bidgood, her ode to Brigid is in the Symbols of Plenty. Ruth Bidgood, Bidgood. She's a Welsh poet. There is so much. The Brigid Sisters actually put out a book. I don't know how easy it is to get, called Rekindling the Flame. And it actually goes through steps of the pilgrimage through Kildare. This Brigid's Healing Well, which is there, and also Brigid's Flame. When the sisters arrived in Kildare, they lit a candle. They lit a flame that they've kept burning this whole time. It continues to burn. And this is the reproducing what happened in the pagan times. There was a temple devoted to Goddess Brigid, and there were women there who tended the flame so it never went out. And it only really went out during the 16th or 17th century when the Catholic Church said, you can't do that anymore. So, but you can see the fire pit where they used to keep the flame at the cathedral in Kildare. That's part of the pilgrimage, but they've moved it to the center now. But that flame has been rekindled and it's burning bright.
Very much a symbol that the flame has been rekindled, an image of hope. Thank you so much, Kathy. This was great.
I enjoyed being with you both. It's great to be together again.
Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in the link in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer with original music composed and performed by John Kingsley. Our technical partner for this series is Citizen Racecar. Post-production by Alex Brower and Jose Miguel Baez, coordinated by Gabriela Montequin.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at We Are Lady Farmer. That's We Are Lady Farmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.